What's up, guys? At this point, I'm honestly getting deja vu because I feel like I've covered this same paddle about 1,000,000 times this year, but here we have the new Joola 3S. This is the UPA-only approved paddle and is not sanctioned for USAP tournaments. So that means if you play APP tournaments or even events like Nationals, you cannot use this paddle there. This paddle should be fine for PPA tournaments, local rec play, and most of your local sanctioned tournaments. I have heard of a few local tournaments saying they aren't going to allow UPA-approved paddles, but we'll have to wait and see if most local tournaments adopt that. Personally, I don't really see that happening. This paddle is claimed to be toned down from the Gen 3 and Mod TA15 in terms of pop and power, so today we're going to let you know what we actually think about that. For full disclosure, I did buy one Perseus 3S for myself when testing this, and then Joola sent me the additional models later on. They had no input on this video, they did not pay for it, and they did not get to preview it before going live. I also don't have a discount code for this paddle, but if you do use the affiliate link in the description to purchase one, it does help support the channel to keep creating content just like this. As far as the specs go, everything is identical to the Mod and Gen 3s that have already been covered. But if you want the notes of my specific units, you can check the link in the description for my paddle database. Inside there, we have all of the 3S stats for the paddles that we have. By the time you see this video, hopefully the 14mm models are added as well. In this video, I'm not going to go in depth on the teardown, but if you want more info on that, you can go listen to a podcast that we recently put out that covers what changed from the Gen 3s to the Gen 3S. If you want the short version of it, the original Gen 3 and mods had thicker cores put into the mold and were intentionally being compressed to generate more power. This is what most of us call core crushing. And this is the reason we saw a lot of people crushing these paddles in such a small period of time. They were already compromised a noticeable amount out of the box, and then the more you used them, the more they broke down. Now, this didn't happen to everyone, but in my local area, it happened to just about every high-level player that owned one of these paddles. The only thing that changed from those paddles to this one is that the 3S uses a core that is not intentionally compressed. I cut mine open, and you can see the core looks much better than on the Gen 3s. Now, this one does have some very small ripples in the top portion, but I've cut open so many Gen 2 paddles at this point, and most of them have these very small ripples at the top. So all of that to say, this core looks about in line with what a lot of the Gen 2 thermoform paddles that I currently see on the market when I cut them open. So throughout this video, as you hear me talk about the 3S not hitting as hard, it makes perfect sense now that we know we're using a paddle that doesn't have a core that is purposely crushed out of the box. The only other thing I'll say that worries me a little bit about the design is that on two of my Perseus units, there are these small gaps between the foam and core, and it seems like an area that could flex more and more as you hit there. So I guess time will just have to tell, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. Now, just a heads up, I will be using the words Mod and Gen 3 interchangeably in this video since they played identical. So if you hear me say one of those words, I am referencing both paddles. First things first, I think this paddle still has a very similar identity as the original Gen 3. It has a similar feel off the face and still makes a bit of a thud noise, and it's definitely still a power paddle. One of the words that I found myself using when describing these two paddles is that it feels like the Gen 3 is looser everywhere inside the paddle, and the 3S just feels tighter and more rigid. The best way I can describe it is that the Gen 3 felt like a trampoline, and the 3S feels like a trampoline with significantly less give or more tension. And that makes sense since a core crushed paddle basically acts as a trampoline. I felt like this meant the power didn't come as effortlessly as it did before on the Gen 3s. With the older models, it felt like you barely had to do anything and the ball would just go nuts. With the 3S, it still hits hard, but you have to put more effort in to get that power out of it, unlike before, where it really didn't take much at all. As far as resets, drop, and dinking goes, it felt much easier than it did before. I felt like I always had to baby the Gen 3s on soft shots, particularly the 16mm models, and I didn't notice that on the 3S. I'm not going to say that this is an easy paddle to use like some of the control paddles on the market, but I did find it considerably easier than the Gen 3s. Overall, I would say the 3S models are successfully toned down, and this paddle feels more balanced than the Gen 3s did. I think the 3S power is more in the realm of a Paddletech TKOC 12.7mm. Now, of course, this is just our early impressions from several play sessions with these, so maybe that would change with even more time on the paddle, but what I can tell you is that when hitting it side by side with a Mod or Gen 3, it's very obvious that these don't hit as hard. It's still powerful, but it isn't rip someone's face off powerful with almost no effort. For some of you, you're gonna love that, and others are going to be disappointed. At this point, I think I'm most curious to see these out in the wild and see if we still have any QC issue reports related to the core. I imagine we're still going to see some core crushing, just like many other Gen 2 paddles on the market, but I hope that we're going to see significantly less before, and it's not going to be a common talking point about this paddle. I still think this is probably a top paddle on the market. But with it only being UPA approved and not being able to be used at USAP sanctioned tournaments, I just wonder how many people are really going to find it worth it to buy one of these when they can't use it everywhere that they normally can. It's a confusing time in the paddle market, and I hope things will get figured out soon. But anyways, here's Aizec's thoughts.
All right, here we go again. My initial thoughts of playtesting and hitting the Joola 3S, to be honest, it's really not that different from the mod or the Gen 3. It feels very similar. One thing I would say, the biggest difference is off the face of the paddle, it's going to feel slightly stiffer. It is not as trampoline-y as the mod or the Gen 3, so if you're expecting it to hit like a cannon and launch the ball, I would get rid of those expectations because it's not that. But it is definitely still a through-and-through power paddle. There's no questions about that. One thing I would say is when it did come to playing a softer game, resetting, dinking, and coming to the kitchen, it did feel, for me personally, slightly more difficult, even though it is less power and toned down than the mod. I prefer that more plush and springy feel. So it being a little bit stiffer, for some reason, I had slightly more issues with that, pop-ups and bad dinks. When it comes to spin, it's definitely nowhere near the Gen 3s. The grit has most definitely been toned down. It feels very similar to the mod if you've played with one of those. But it's back to being normal and what I would consider about average. But with that being said, drives still felt great. I was able to get tons of dip on the ball and still had plenty of pace to go with it. When it comes to hands battles, it still feels like you have a huge advantage in my opinion. The pop and acceleration off of the face with that, what they call propulsion core, accelerates the ball so quickly that I feel like you don't have to have a big swing. You just need a little punch and it just launches the ball. So when it comes to hands battles, I would say that is where this paddle excels the most. One benefit with this paddle is I did like that it came in a little bit lower swing weight and static weight for it being elongated. I believe the swing weight was right around 117 and the static weight was right around 7.9 ounces. So in terms of it being elongated, that is on the lighter end. It does feel very fast in the hands, and with it being faster in the hands, I feel like that does help my hands battles, and it already excels there, so it feels amazing. Also, with it being a UPA only approved paddle, realistically, you're probably only going to be able to play PPAs with it. If you play APPs, they will not let you use this paddle, so that is something I would keep in mind. Now, when it comes to your local rec players, that's a whole nother story. I'll let you guys deal with that. Anyways, that's all we've got for this first look. Appreciate you watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.